There is a man you have never heard of who spent something like 7 years in a Spanish prison for the crime of breathing out smoke. His name was Rodrigo de Jerez. He was a sailor, one of the crew Columbus dragged across the Atlantic in 1492, and somewhere in Cuba, he watched the local people roll dried leaves into a fat little tube, set one end on fire, and pull the smoke through the other. He tried it. He liked it. He liked it enough to carry the habit home to his town in southern Spain, where he strolled down the street one day with smoke curling out of his nose and mouth, and his neighbors did the only sensible thing they could think of. They reported him to the Inquisition, because obviously a man with smoke pouring out of his face had let the devil inside. By the time they let him out, half of Spain had picked up the same filthy, wonderful habit, and nobody was getting arrested for it anymore. That is the cigar in a single story. Forbidden one minute, fashionable the next, and somehow always tangled up with sin. So let's actually start where Rodrigo started, because the cigar did not begin in a wood-paneled gentleman's club. It began in the Americas, thousands of years before any European showed up to be horrified by it. The peoples of the Caribbean and Central America, the Taino, the Maya, and others, had been growing and smoking tobacco for a very long time, and for them it was not a luxury. It was closer to a sacrament. Tobacco smoke carried prayers upward. Shamans used it to reach the spirit world, to heal, to seal agreements, to mark the big moments of a life. There are Maya carvings, more than 1,000 years old, showing figures smoking rolled leaves. The very word we use may come straight from them. Some trace cigar back to the Mayan word cigar, meaning roughly to smoke. And here is a name you'll want to hold on to for later. The Taino called their rolled bundles of tobacco something that sounded to Spanish ears like cohiba. Remember that word. It comes back in the strangest way about 5 centuries down the line. When the Spanish brought tobacco home, Europe lost its mind over it, and not gently. There was a roughly 100-year stretch where the powerful people of the world genuinely could not decide whether this stuff was medicine or menace, and they kept lurching violently between the two. In France, a diplomat named Jean Nicot sent tobacco to the Queen as a miracle cure for headaches, and we still carry his name around today, because nicotine is named after him. Doctors prescribe tobacco for everything: bad breath, toothache, cancer, the plague. Meanwhile, plenty of rulers wanted it gone. The King of England, James I, despised it so much that in 1604 he personally wrote a furious little essay calling smoking a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, and dangerous to the lungs, which, give the man credit, was a few centuries ahead of the science. Other rulers went much further than writing mean reviews. In parts of the Ottoman Empire, in Russia, in China, at various points you could be tortured, mutilated, or executed for smoking. None of it worked. You could threaten people with the gallows and they would still find a quiet corner to light up. If you ever want proof of how stubborn human appetite is, this is it. The harder anyone pushed, the faster tobacco spread. But tobacco is not yet a cigar. A pile of leaves is not a cigar any more than a field of grapes is a bottle of wine. The thing we actually recognize, a tight roll of cured tobacco wrapped in a tobacco leaf, that was perfected in Spain. And it became an industry in one city in particular, Seville. In the 1700s, the Spanish crown built an enormous tobacco factory there, a stone monster of a building so grand it looked more like a palace than a workshop, and for a while it was one of the largest industrial buildings in all of Europe. Inside it, thousands of workers rolled cigars by hand, and over time that workforce became overwhelmingly female. The cigarreras of Seville became famous, or depending on who you asked, infamous. They had a reputation for being fiercely independent, sharp-tongued, and completely unbothered by what polite society thought of them. If that character rings a bell, it should. One of them became the most famous factory worker in the history of art. When Bizet wrote his opera Carmen, his heroine, the seductive, doomed, free-spirited Carmen, works in exactly that Seville cigar factory. A whole tragic love story, built around a woman who rolls cigars for a living. From Spain, the trade naturally drifted to where the best tobacco on earth happened to grow, and that brings us to the island this entire story has been circling: Cuba. There is a strip of land in western Cuba called the Vuelta Abajo, and for reasons of soil, sun, humidity, and 100 things nobody can fully bottle, tobacco grown there is simply better. Connoisseurs talk about Cuban tobacco the way wine snobs talk about a particular hillside in Burgundy. So Cuba became the beating heart of the cigar world, and through the 1800s the great houses were born, names that still sit on humidor shelves today. Partagas, founded in the 1840s by a man who would later be found mysteriously murdered on his own plantation. Romeo y Julieta, yes, named after the Shakespeare play. And H. Upmann, which has one of my favorite origin stories of the bunch, because it was started by a German banker. The Upmann brothers ran a bank in Havana, and they started handing out boxes of their own cigars to favorite clients. The cigars became so beloved that the bank almost became a side hustle. They were practically using cigars as a second currency, little brown bonds you could set on fire. Now I want to take you onto the factory floor because this is where the romance of the cigar really lives, and where it earns the mystique it trades on. Rolling a fine cigar by hand is a genuine craft that takes years to master. There are 3 jobs the tobacco has to do. Deep inside is the filler, the blend of leaves that gives the smoke its body and flavor. Around that goes the binder, a tougher leaf that holds the bunch together. And on the outside is the wrapper, the smooth, flawless, expensive leaf that is the cigar's skin, and its handshake, the part you actually see and judge. A skilled roller, a torcedor, builds all of that by hand and feel hundreds of times a day, each one supposed to draw and burn just right. It is patient, repetitive, quiet work. And out of that quiet came one of the most charming traditions in any industry I know of. Picture a long room full of people rolling cigars, hour after hour, hands busy, minds bored out of their skulls. So starting in the 1860s, the Cuban factories hired someone to fix the boredom. A lector. A reader. One person who sat at the front of the room, often on a raised platform, and read aloud to everyone else all day long. Newspapers in the morning, so the workers, many of whom could not read, stayed better informed about politics in the world than half the upper class. And then, in the afternoons, novels. Big, dramatic, thrilling novels. The rollers would vote on what they wanted to hear. And one book they absolutely loved was Alexandre Dumas's tale of betrayal and revenge, The Count of Monte Cristo. They loved it so much that years later, when a factory owner named Menendez launched a brand new cigar in 1935, he reached for the book his rollers adored and named it Monte Cristo. He put a little triangle of swords on the band as a nod to the duels in the story. Today, it is one of the best-selling cigars on the planet, and almost nobody who smokes one knows it is named after a paperback that some reader once performed out loud to a room full of people with tobacco-stained fingers. If you're the kind of person who enjoys knowing the buried story behind everyday objects, this channel is built entirely for you, so go ahead and subscribe before we get to the part where a president panic buys 1,200 cigars in a single night. Because while Cuba was perfecting the art, the United States was busy becoming the cigar's single most enthusiastic customer, and Americans took their cigars seriously. Take Ulysses S. Grant, the Union general who won the Civil War and later became president. Early in the war, a newspaper reported that Grant had calmly smoked a cigar through one of his big victories, and grateful admirers responded by mailing him cigars. Not a box. Not a few boxes. Reportedly something like 10,000 boxes of cigars flooded in. Grant, being human, did what any of us would do with a free mountain of cigars, and started smoking around 20 of them a day. It very likely killed him. He died of throat cancer, racing to finish his memoirs before the end. Then there's Mark Twain, who smoked cheap cigars constantly and made jokes about it that people still repeat, his best line being that quitting smoking was the easiest thing in the world, since he'd done it hundreds of times. And the manufacturing followed the demand. A whole American cigar capital grew up in Tampa, Florida, in a district called Ybor City, where Cuban and Spanish immigrants rolled millions of cigars and brought their lectors and their traditions right along with them. And then the cigar got dethroned in its own house, which is a twist people forget. For most of the 1800s, if a working man smoked, he smoked a cigar or a pipe. The cigarette, that thin little paper-wrapped thing, was seen as a flimsy, almost effeminate novelty. What changed everything was a machine. In the 1880s, an automated cigarette rolling machine arrived that could spit out cigarettes faster than any human could ever roll a cigar, which made them absurdly cheap. Cheap enough for everyone, every day, all the time. The cigar could never compete on price, because a real cigar still had to be built by skilled human hands. So the cigarette became the smoke of the masses, the thing soldiers were handed in 2 world wars, the everyday addiction. And the cigar quietly retreated into what it has basically remained ever since. Not a habit. An occasion. Something you smoke to mark a deal, a birth, a victory, a Tuesday you've decided to feel good about. The cigarette is for need. The cigar is for show. They split the world between them, and the cigar took the smaller, richer, more theatrical half. Which sets the stage for 1959, the year a young revolutionary named Fidel Castro marched into Havana and turned the entire cigar world upside down. Castro's new government seized the cigar industry, the way it seized nearly everything. The famous family companies were nationalized, their owners often fleeing the island with nothing. The Menendez family, the people behind Montecristo and H. Upmann, walked away from their fortune and started over abroad. And this is where the story fractures into two, in a way that still confuses people standing in front of a humidor today. Because those exiled families took their brand names and their know-how and rebuilt in other countries, mostly the Dominican Republic. Meanwhile, the Cuban government kept making cigars under those same old names back in Havana. So you ended up with two completely different cigars wearing the same name. There is a Cuban Montecristo and a Dominican Montecristo, a Cuban H. Upmann and a non-Cuban one. Same names, different countries, different leaves, decades of trademark lawsuits, all because of a revolution. And the man who caused it became a cigar icon himself, which is its own kind of joke. Fidel Castro and his cigar were inseparable in the public mind, and the Cuban state created a brand new cigar just for him and his inner circle. Here's where that word from the very beginning comes roaring back. They called it cohiba, the same name the Taino had used for their tobacco rolls when Columbus's sailors first watched them smoke. For years, cohiba was not for sale to anyone. It was a private luxury handed out as a gift from the Cuban government to visiting presidents, ambassadors, and dignitaries. The most exclusive cigar in the world, and you literally could not buy it. You had to be given one by Castro himself. It only went on sale to the public many years later, and by then the mystique was permanent. But the truly delicious irony belongs to the United States, and to one president in particular. In early 1962, John F. Kennedy was about to sign the trade embargo that would cut the United States off from Cuba, cigars very much included. Kennedy loved Cuban cigars, specifically a small, elegant H. Upmann. So, according to his press secretary Pierre Salinger, who told this story himself for years, the night before signing the embargo into law, Kennedy quietly called Salinger in and asked him to go get cigars, a lot of them. Salinger spent the evening combing the shops of Washington and came back the next morning having scrounged up around 1,200 of the president's favorite Cuban cigars. Only once his personal stash was safely secured did Kennedy pull out his pen and sign the document that made it illegal for every other American to buy the very same thing. And what that ban accomplished, more than anything, was magic of a sort no advertising agency could ever buy. Overnight, the Cuban cigar became forbidden fruit in the largest market on earth. You couldn't have one. Which meant, of course, that everyone suddenly wanted one. Generations of Americans have smuggled them home from Canada and Mexico in their luggage, and the phrase Cuban cigar became shorthand for illicit, top shelf, can't get it luxury, purely because their own government told them no. That forbidden fruit glow set off one last great chapter in the 1990s, when the cigar came roaring back into fashion in a way that had nothing to do with smoking and everything to do with image. A glossy magazine called Cigar Aficionado launched in 1992 and put movie stars and athletes on its covers with a cigar in hand, and just like that, the cigar was the ultimate accessory of success. Cigar bars opened in every fashionable city. Wall Street traders, celebrities, anyone with money to flash suddenly wanted to be photographed wrapped in a cloud of premium smoke. It was the cigar doing the only thing it has ever really done well, which is announce to the room that you have arrived. And underneath all the glamour, there is the part the marketing prefers you forget, which is that this is still tobacco, and tobacco still does what tobacco does. The most cautionary tale here is Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, a man so attached to his cigars that he smoked around 20 a day and refused to stop even after the warnings became impossible to ignore. He developed cancer of the mouth and jaw, endured more than 30 operations over many painful years, and kept smoking through nearly all of it. The cigar he loved disfigured and ultimately helped kill him. The pleasure and the price have always traveled together. They did for Grant. They did for Freud. The cigar has never once pretended to be good for you, and that, perversely, is part of the appeal. It is indulgence with no excuse attached. So what is a cigar, really, after all of that? It is one of the very few luxury objects on earth that you destroy completely in the act of enjoying it. You spend real money on a thing made by skilled hands from a plant grown in one specific patch of dirt, and then you set it on fire and turn it into smoke and ash and nothing. There is something almost defiant about that. It was sacred to the people who invented it and satanic to the Europeans who stole it. It made bankers and broke generals. It built a Florida city and crowned a Cuban dictator. It got one man thrown in prison for breathing strangely and got another 1,200 of them rushed across Washington in the dark. For 500 years, it has been illegal and irresistible, holy and toxic, the smoke of saints and revolutionaries and show-offs, and through every twist it has done the one job it was always best at: getting noticed. Rodrigo de Jerez found that out the hard way, walking down a Spanish street with the devil supposedly leaking out of his face. He just had the bad luck to be 500 years early to the party. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the channel's full of it, so stick around and tell me in the comments which everyday vice or luxury you want pulled apart next.